There was a woman whose face launched 1,000 dreams. Her image adorned the sides of bombers during World War II. Servicemen carried her photograph into battle. When she walked onto the screen, audiences forgot to breathe. She was called the Love Goddess, a title that promised everything and delivered nothing but heartache. Behind the glamorous facade was a woman who couldn't remember her lines, couldn't find her way home, couldn't recognize her own daughter. This is the story of Rita Hayworth, the Hollywood goddess who faded away into a darkness nobody understood. The girl who danced before she could walk. Margarita Carmen Cancino entered the world on October 17, 1918, in Brooklyn, New York. Show business wasn't just in her blood, it was her birthright. Her father, Eduardo Cancino, had come from Spain, a dancer whose skills had earned him work in the competitive world of vaudeville. Her mother, Volga Hayworth, had performed in the legendary Ziegfeld Follies, one of the most prestigious dance troupes in America. By the time little Margarita could walk, she was learning to dance. Eduardo saw potential in his daughter that went beyond ordinary talent. He trained her rigorously, teaching her the Spanish dances that were his specialty. By age 6, she was performing on stage with her parents. At 12, she was dancing professionally in nightclubs and casinos along the California-Mexico border, places where a young girl shouldn't have been, but where her father's ambitions led her nonetheless. The family had moved to Los Angeles when Margarita was 8, hoping to break into the film industry. Eduardo opened a dance studio near the corner of Sunset and Vine, right in the heart of Hollywood. He found work as a choreographer for Fox Studios, and young Margarita continued performing in the family's nightclub act. The work was grueling, the hours late, the audiences often rough. But it was preparation for what lay ahead, though nobody could have imagined just how high she would rise, or how far she would eventually fall. But before we get to the tragedy that would define her later years, Margarita Cancino had to become Rita Hayworth. And that transformation would cost her more than anyone realized. The man who remade her. In 1935, 17-year-old Margarita Cancino caught the attention of Edward Judson while performing at the Foreign Club in Tijuana. Judson was 41 years old, a businessman and promoter who'd been married twice before. He saw something in the dark-haired teenager that went beyond her dancing ability. He saw dollar signs. Judson pursued Margarita with single-minded determination. He promised her parents he could make their daughter a star. Eduardo Cancino, despite his initial reservations about the age difference, eventually gave his blessing. On May 29, 1937, 18-year-old Margarita married Judson in Las Vegas. The marriage enraged Eduardo, causing a rift in the Cancino family that wouldn't heal until the divorce 5 years later. What happened next was a systematic recreation of Margarita Cancino's identity. Judson decided that everything about her needed to change. Her name sounded too ethnic, too specifically Latin American, for the roles he wanted her to play. He combined her mother's maiden name, Hayworth, with a shortened version of her first name. Margarita Cancino became Rita Hayworth, but the name change was just the beginning. Judson looked at Rita's hairline and determined it was too low, making her face appear too Spanish. He arranged for her to undergo painful electrolysis treatments that raised her hairline nearly an inch. The procedure took 2 years and left her in constant pain. He also insisted she dye her naturally dark hair auburn, a shade that would photograph better in the Technicolor films that were becoming popular. Rita later described Judson as extremely jealous and quarrelsome. She wasn't permitted to make any decisions for herself. He told her she couldn't do anything on her own. Her personality, she said, crawled deeper and deeper into a shell. But Judson was also making things happen for her career. He worked his connections relentlessly, getting her screen tests, arranging publicity, pushing her name in front of studio executives. In 1937, Columbia Pictures signed Rita to a 7-year contract. What Rita didn't realize at the time was that Judson was also helping himself to her money. He controlled her finances completely, directing her earnings into investments and accounts she knew nothing about. When she finally filed for divorce on February 24, 1942, citing cruelty, she walked away from the marriage broken homeless, despite having worked steadily in Hollywood for 5 years. Judson had manipulated her into signing over considerable property and had threatened her with great harm if she didn't comply with his financial demands. The marriage had given Rita a career, but it had also taught her that men would use her, a lesson that would repeat itself in increasingly painful ways throughout her life. The love goddess is born. With Judson out of her life, Rita's career began to soar. She'd already appeared in several films, but her breakthrough came in 1939 when she played an unfaithful wife opposite Cary Grant in Only Angels Have Wings. The role showcased not just her beauty, but her ability to convey complex emotions beneath a glamorous surface. In 1941, Rita achieved something remarkable. She starred opposite both James Cagney in The Strawberry Blonde and Fred Astaire in You'll Never Get Rich. Astaire, one of Hollywood's most demanding dancers and a performer who rarely praised his partners, would later call Rita his favorite dance partner. That same year, Life magazine ran a feature on Rita, and writer Winthrop Sargent gave her a nickname that would follow her forever: the Great American Love Goddess. The photographs from this period show Rita at the height of her beauty. Her auburn hair caught the light like fire. Her smile suggested secrets. Her figure, showcased in form-fitting gowns, became the standard by which other actresses were measured. In 1944, a photograph of Rita kneeling on a bed in black lace nightwear became the unofficial pin-up for American servicemen serving overseas in World War II. The image was reproduced millions of times, stuck inside countless footlockers, pasted to the walls of barracks from England to the Pacific. Rita didn't mind the attention. When asked about becoming a symbol of desire for men far from home, she responded simply, "Why should she mind?" She liked having her picture taken and being glamorous. She remembered the times when nobody wanted to take her picture, and she preferred her current situation. In 1944, Rita starred in CoverGirl opposite Gene Kelly, a film that helped establish both performers among Hollywood's top stars. Then came 1946, and Gilda, the film that would define Rita Hayworth forever. In Gilda, Rita played the quintessential noir woman, a duplicitous temptress and an abused victim in equal measure. The film was daring for its time, packed with implications that pushed against the boundaries of Hollywood censorship. Rita's performance of the song Put the Blame on Mame, during which she performed a striptease that consisted entirely of removing one long black glove, became one of cinema's most famous scenes. The moment when she flipped her hair back and looked at the camera with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability, that single gesture made Rita Hayworth immortal. But by the time Gilda premiered, Rita's personal life was already in turmoil again. She'd fallen in love with a brilliant, difficult man who would give her a daughter and years of heartache. The genius who couldn't settle down. Orson Welles spotted Rita in a magazine photograph and became obsessed with meeting her. The boy genius of American cinema, the man who'd created Citizen Kane at age 25, pursued Rita with the same intensity he brought to his films. They married on September 7th, 1943, during the run of the Mercury Wonder Show. Rita was 24. Welles was 28. Welles's secretary described them as the happiest, most delighted couple she'd ever seen. Rita had found someone who matched her fame, someone who seemed to understand the pressures of stardom. In December 1944, they had a daughter, Rebecca. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. But Wells wasn't built for domestic life. Within 2 years of their marriage, he was pursuing other women. Rita wanted to buy a home and create stability for their family. Wells told her he didn't want the responsibility. He explained to her during their divorce proceedings that he never should have married in the first place, that marriage interfered with his freedom and his way of life. Rita moved out with Rebecca in 1946. They divorced the following year, briefly reconciling in 1948 to make The Lady from Shanghai together. In that film, Wells directed Rita in one of her most complex performances. He also cut off her famous auburn hair and bleached it platinum blonde for the role. A decision made without consulting Columbia Pictures head Harry Cohn, who was furious at this tampering with his studio's most valuable asset. The Lady from Shanghai was critically acclaimed, but failed at the box office. Audiences wanted to see Rita Hayworth as the love goddess, not as a platinum blonde in an art film. But for Rita, the film represented something else. It was proof that she had dramatic range beyond the glamorous roles that had made her famous. Years later, she would tell Wells something that broke his heart. The only happiness she'd ever had in her life had been with him. He could only reply that if that had been her happiness, he couldn't imagine what the rest of her life must have been. And indeed, what came next would test Rita in ways that fame and heartbreak never had. The prince who couldn't be faithful. While her marriage to Wells was crumbling, Rita had become involved with Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire who collected starlets like other men collected stamps. When she became pregnant with Hughes's child, he refused to marry her. Rita fled to Europe for a procedure to end the pregnancy, a decision that left her emotionally devastated. In 1948, while still in Europe, Rita attended a party on the French Riviera. There she met Prince Ali Khan, the son of Sultan Muhammad Shah, Aga Khan III, the spiritual leader of the Ismaili sect of Shia Islam. Ali was handsome, charming, wealthy beyond imagination, and completely captivated by Rita. The feeling was mutual. Their courtship was a media sensation. When they married on May 27, 1949, Rita became Princess Rita, a real-life fairy tale that predated Grace Kelly's marriage to Prince Rainier by 7 years. Rita left Hollywood behind, announcing her retirement from films to travel the world with her prince. On December 18, 1949, she gave birth to their daughter, Princess Yasmin Aga Khan. For a brief time, Rita seemed to have found what she'd been searching for: love, security, legitimacy beyond her status as a movie star. But Prince Ali Khan was a notorious playboy, and marriage didn't change his habits. He continued pursuing other women, sometimes openly, sometimes attempting discretion. Rita, already insecure from her previous marriages, found herself unable to compete with Khan's glamorous international friends. She felt out of place in his world, a Hollywood actress playing princess while her husband entertained other women. The marriage lasted 4 years. The divorce proceedings were bitter, particularly when it came to custody of Yasmin. Khan wanted their daughter raised as a Muslim in his family's tradition. Rita insisted the child should be raised Christian in America. The battle dragged through courts on 2 continents until Khan's death in an automobile accident in 1960 ended the dispute. Rita gained full custody of Yasmin, but the years of conflict had left deep wounds. What Rita didn't know was that her difficulties coping with the stress of the Khan marriage and divorce weren't just emotional. Something was happening inside her brain, something that wouldn't be understood for decades. The marriage that turned violent. After divorcing Khan in 1953, Rita immediately married singer Dick Haymes in September of that year. It was a rebound relationship from the beginning, and it quickly became something much darker. Haymes was in serious financial trouble. He owed money to the IRS and to his ex-wives. Legal problems followed him constantly, and as the pressure mounted, he became increasingly unpredictable and controlling. The marriage that had seemed like a fresh start descended into a cycle of litigation, court appearances, and turmoil. Then, in 1955, at the Coconut Grove nightclub in Los Angeles, Haymes struck Rita in the face in front of other patrons. Rita didn't make excuses or give him another chance. She packed her bags and left him. The incident shook her badly, and her doctor ordered her to remain in bed for several days. The divorce was granted in December 1955, ending two of the most stressful years of Rita's life. What nobody realized at the time was that Rita's ability to cope with stress was beginning to deteriorate in ways that went beyond normal emotional responses. Her friends noticed she seemed more fragile, more prone to outbursts, less resilient than before. They attributed it to the trauma of the Haymes marriage. They didn't know it was something far more serious. The final marriage. Rita took time to recover in Europe after the Haymes divorce. When she returned to Hollywood in 1956, she still had her Columbia contract, and her name still meant something at the box office. She starred in Fire Down Below with Robert Mitchum and Jack Lemmon, then Pal Joey in 1957 with Frank Sinatra and Kim Novak. In early 1958, Rita met producer James Hill. After knowing each other for just 4 months, they married on February 2nd, 1958. Hill put Rita in Separate Tables, a prestige drama that earned strong reviews, though the Harvard Lampoon perversely named her the worst actress of 1958 for her performance. Hill had different ideas about Rita's career than Rita did. He wanted her to keep working, to capitalize on her name, while she could still command decent roles. Rita wanted them both to retire from Hollywood, to build a quiet life away from the constant pressure of the industry. The fundamental disagreement poisoned their relationship. On September 1st, 1961, Rita filed for divorce, citing extreme mental cruelty. Hill later wrote a memoir about their marriage, in which he suggested it collapsed because of their different visions for the future. But he also hinted at something else, that Rita was changing in ways he couldn't understand, that she was becoming someone he didn't recognize. Rita was 42 years old when her 5th and final marriage ended. She never entered into another serious relationship. For a woman who had been called the love goddess, who had been desired by millions, the remainder of her life would be marked by increasing isolation and confusion, when memory begins to slip. The early 1960s brought subtle changes that Rita's friends and colleagues began to notice. She would repeat the same questions in phone conversations. She seemed confused about simple matters. Her daughter Yasmin, away at boarding school, found her mother's weekly calls increasingly troubling. Rita would ask the same things over and over, seeming unable to retain information from one moment to the next. Rita's film roles became smaller and less frequent. In the 1960s, she appeared in a handful of forgettable pictures. Directors who worked with her noticed she had trouble concentrating. She struggled to remember lines, needing many more takes than before. On set, she would sometimes seem lost, uncertain about where she was supposed to be or what she was supposed to do. In the early 1970s, Rita was offered the opportunity to replace Lauren Bacall in the Broadway production of Applause. It should have been a career revival, a chance for Rita Hayworth to prove she could still command a stage. But when rehearsals began, Rita discovered she couldn't remember a play's worth of dialogue. The words wouldn't stay in her mind, no matter how many times she reviewed them. She had to withdraw from the production, humiliated and confused about what was happening to her. Rita's last film was The Wrath of God in 1972. By this point, her difficulty remembering lines and maintaining focus made her nearly unemployable. At 54 years old, Rita Hayworth's career was effectively over. But it wasn't just her career that was ending. Rita herself was beginning to disappear. The diagnosis nobody wanted. By the mid-1970s, Rita's behavior had become alarming. She would fly into sudden rages without apparent cause. She'd become disoriented in familiar places. She drank heavily, and many people attributed her problems to that. The press certainly did, publishing stories about Rita Hayworth's alcoholism, often accompanied by unflattering photographs that showed how much she'd aged. In March 1974, both of Rita's brothers died within a week of each other. The grief pushed Rita deeper into drinking, and her public appearances became increasingly erratic. In January 1976, she was removed from a TWA flight at London's Heathrow Airport after having an angry outburst while travelling with her agent. Photographs from the incident showed a dishevelled woman who bore little resemblance to the glamorous star the world remembered. The papers had a field day. Rita's daughter, Yasmin, who had graduated college in 1973 and moved to New York City, found herself in an impossible situation. She could see her mother deteriorating but had no idea what to do. The distance between them made everything worse. Yasmin believed her mother was aware that something was wrong with her memory, but didn't know how to cope with it. Everyone assumed it was the drinking. Even doctors attributed Rita's symptoms to what they called chronic issues with substances, but Yasmin wasn't convinced. Her mother's behavior had a quality that went beyond what substances alone could explain. The rage, the confusion, the memory loss. They seemed to follow patterns that didn't quite match what she'd read about substance-related cognitive problems. Finally, in 1980, Rita underwent comprehensive testing. The diagnosis, when it came, provided answers but no comfort: early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Rita had likely been experiencing symptoms since the late 1950s or early 1960s, meaning she'd spent 2 decades slowly losing her mind, while everyone assumed she was just difficult or troubled or drinking too much. Yasmin later described the relief of simply having a name for what was happening. For years, they'd all thought it was something else. Substance problems, mental health challenges, the stress of failed marriages. Now they knew. It was Alzheimer's, a disease that was barely understood at the time and for which there was no treatment, no cure, no hope of recovery. And Rita's journey into darkness was just beginning, when the goddess forgets her name. After the diagnosis, Yasmin made the difficult decision to move her mother into her New York apartment so she could provide full-time care. Rita was only in her early 60s, but she required constant supervision. She couldn't be trusted to cook for herself, to take medication on her own, to go out without getting lost. The progression of Alzheimer's is cruel in its specificity. It doesn't just steal memories, it dismantles a person piece by piece, erasing first the recent past, then older memories, then eventually the basic functions that make someone themselves. For Rita, this meant losing not just her film career and her public identity, but eventually her private self as well. Rita would look at photographs of herself from Gilda and not recognize the woman on screen. She'd ask Yasmin who that beautiful actress was, genuinely curious about the stranger with the auburn hair and the captivating smile. When Yasmin explained it was her, Rita would laugh as if Yasmin were joking. That couldn't be her. She'd never been that beautiful, had she? The rages that had been attributed to substance issues or difficult personality were actually a symptom of the disease. As the Alzheimer's progressed, Rita would become angry without understanding why. She'd lash out at Yasmin, the person caring for her, because the disease made it impossible to regulate emotions or understand consequences. Then, minutes later, she'd forget the outburst had happened and wonder why Yasmin seemed upset. Yasmin later spoke about what those years were like, the patience required, the heartbreak of watching her mother vanish, the exhaustion of being the sole caregiver for someone with advanced dementia. But she also spoke about the moments of grace, the times when Rita would seem almost like herself again, when recognition would flicker in her eyes before fading once more. By the mid-1980s, Rita required round-the-clock care. She could no longer dress herself. She had trouble eating. Walking became difficult, then impossible. The woman who had danced with Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, whose body had moved with such grace and precision, was now confined to a bed or a chair, her limbs no longer responding to her will. The goddess becomes a cause. In 1984, with her mother's condition worsening, Yasmin did something remarkable. She decided to go public with Rita's diagnosis. Alzheimer's disease was barely understood by the general public in 1984. It carried stigma, shame, the sense that the patient was somehow at fault for their mental deterioration. Many families hid Alzheimer's patients away, embarrassed by their condition. But Yasmin saw an opportunity to transform private tragedy into public good. With the help of activists and medical professionals, she organized the first Rita Hayworth Gala in New York City to raise money for Alzheimer's research. The event combined Hollywood glamour with serious advocacy, drawing celebrities, donors, and media attention to a disease that had been largely ignored. The gala was successful beyond anyone's expectations. It raised substantial funds for Alzheimer's research and, more importantly, brought national attention to a disease that millions of families were dealing with in silence. Yasmin became the public face of Alzheimer's advocacy, speaking openly about her mother's condition and the need for better understanding and treatment. The publicity surrounding Rita's illness was unprecedented. President Ronald Reagan, himself a former actor who would later develop Alzheimer's, issued statements praising Yasmin's courage in bringing attention to the disease. Medical funding for Alzheimer's research increased significantly in the years following Rita's diagnosis becoming public. The Rita Hayworth Gala became an annual event, eventually evolving into multiple galas in different cities that continue to this day. But while Yasmin was fighting for a cure, Rita was losing her final battles. The end of the goddess. By early 1987, Rita's condition had deteriorated to the point where hospice care was being discussed. She spent most of her time in bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. The sparkling personality that had captivated millions was gone, replaced by a shell that breathed and occasionally opened its eyes, but showed no recognition of the world around it. In February 1987, Rita lapsed into a semi-coma. She lingered for 3 months, her body continuing to function even as her mind had long since departed. Yasmin stayed by her side, holding vigil as her mother's breathing grew shallower, her responses to stimuli weaker. On May 14, 1987, at 12:45 in the afternoon, Rita Hayworth died in the apartment she shared with Yasmin in Manhattan. The official cause of death was complications associated with Alzheimer's disease. She was 68 years old. The news of Rita's death made headlines around the world. Tributes poured in from fellow actors, directors, and fans who remembered her in her glory days. President Reagan issued a statement calling Rita one of America's most beloved stars, noting that she had given audiences wonderful moments on stage and screen. He also acknowledged that her courage in facing Alzheimer's publicly had been a great service, bringing worldwide attention to a disease they all hoped would soon be cured. A funeral service was held on May 18, 1987, at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. Pallbearers included actors Ricardo Montalban, Glenn Ford, Cesar Romero, and Anthony Franciosa, men who had worked with Rita during her peak years and had watched her star rise and then fade. Choreographer Hermes Pan, who had worked with Rita and Fred Astaire, also served as a pallbearer. The service was private, attended only by family and close friends. Rita was interred at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California. Her headstone carries an inscription chosen by Yasmin. To yesterday's companionship and tomorrow's reunion. It's a statement of faith and hope, suggesting that what was lost will one day be found again, that the woman who forgot everything might somehow, somewhere, remember. The legacy of forgetting. Rita Hayworth's life reads like a Greek tragedy. The beautiful woman cursed by the gods, given everything and then watching it all slowly stripped away. She was born to perform, trained from childhood to be a dancer and entertainer. She was transformed from Margarita Cancino into Rita Hayworth, her ethnic features altered to fit Hollywood's standards, her name changed to sound less foreign. She became one of the most famous women in the world. Her image represented desire for an entire generation of men who'd never met her. She married 5 times, searching for love and finding only men who wanted to possess her, use her, or couldn't stay faithful to her. She had 2 daughters, Rebecca with Orson Welles and Yasmin with Prince Ali Khan. But her relationships with both were complicated by her failing mental health in later years. And then came the cruelest twist, the disease that made her forget everything. The films she'd starred in, the men she'd loved, the life she'd lived, all of it erased bit by bit, until nothing remained but the shell of the goddess. The public disclosure of Rita's Alzheimer's diagnosis changed the landscape of dementia care in America. Before Rita Hayworth, Alzheimer's was rarely discussed publicly. It was something shameful, something families dealt with behind closed doors. Rita's celebrity and Yasmin's advocacy brought the disease into the open, forcing conversations about elder care, medical research funding, and the need for better understanding of degenerative brain conditions. Federal funding for Alzheimer's research increased dramatically in the years after Rita's diagnosis became public. The Rita Hayworth Gala became a template for how celebrity could be leveraged for medical advocacy. In 1999, Rita was named one of the 25 greatest female stars of classic Hollywood cinema by the American Film Institute. The woman who'd forgotten who she was had secured her place in film history. What they said about her. Rita Hayworth famously said that men fell in love with Gilda, but woke up with her. It was her way of expressing the disconnect between her public image and her private self, between the love goddess who appeared on screen and the insecure woman who couldn't hold a marriage together. Fred Astaire, who danced with many partners over his long career, called Rita his favorite. He appreciated not just her technical skill, but her emotional availability as a performer, her willingness to be vulnerable on camera. Gene Kelly, who co-starred with her in CoverGirl, described working with Rita as one of the highlights of his career. Orson Welles, despite their failed marriage, never spoke ill of Rita. In interviews late in his life, he expressed regret about how their relationship had ended. He acknowledged that he hadn't been ready for the commitment she'd needed, that his ego and his work had taken precedence over their family. He also noted that Rita's insecurity stemmed from real experiences. The men in her life, starting with Judson, had used her and then discarded her. She had reason not to trust. The directors who worked with Rita during her prime years remembered her differently than the tabloids portrayed her. Charles Vidor, who directed her in Gilda and several other films, spoke of her professionalism, and her willingness to take direction. She wasn't a diva who threw tantrums or made impossible demands. She showed up on time, knew her choreography, and gave directors what they asked for. The difficulties came later, when the disease was already affecting her cognition, but before anyone understood what was happening. Glenn Ford, Rita's co-star in Gilda and several other films, remained protective of her memory long after her death. He refused to participate in projects that he felt sensationalized her struggles or reduced her to tabloid headlines. He wanted people to remember Rita the performer, not Rita the tragedy. That loyalty spoke to the genuine affection she inspired in people who actually knew her, as opposed to those who only knew her image. Yasmin has spoken extensively about her mother in the years since Rita's death. She's described a woman who was kind, loving, and deeply aware of her own limitations. Rita knew she wasn't a great actress in the traditional sense. She was a dancer and a glamorous personality who happened to act. But she also knew she'd worked hard, had survived an industry that chewed up and discarded women routinely, and had left behind work that mattered. Yasmin has also been honest about the difficulty of the later years, the challenge of caring for someone with advanced Alzheimer's, and the grief of losing her mother twice, once to the disease and once to death. But she's also emphasized that despite everything, they had a close relationship filled with mutual respect and love. That relationship sustained Yasmin through the hardest years and motivated her advocacy work that continues to this day. The woman beneath the goddess. Looking back at Rita Hayworth's life, it's impossible not to wonder what might have been different. What if she'd been born 20 years later, when Hollywood was beginning to relax its strictest standards about ethnic appearance? What if she'd never met Edward Judson, or if she'd refused to let him remake her? What if one of her 5 marriages had actually worked? What if Alzheimer's hadn't stolen her mind 2 decades before it took her life? But these counterfactuals miss something essential. Rita Hayworth lived the life she lived, and that life had meaning and impact beyond the tragedies that marked it. She broke barriers as a dancer who could hold her own with Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly. She gave performances in Gilda, in The Lady from Shanghai, in CoverGirl, that remain watchable and powerful 8 decades later. She survived 5 failed marriages and continued working, continued trying to find happiness, continued showing up even when it would have been easier to retreat. The transformation from Margarita Cancino to Rita Hayworth represented more than just a name change or a physical makeover. It symbolized what countless performers had to sacrifice to succeed in an industry that demanded conformity. Rita lost part of her heritage, underwent painful procedures to alter her appearance, and spent her life inhabiting an identity that wasn't quite her own. Yet she never publicly complained about these sacrifices. She understood they were the price of entry, and she paid it willingly because performing was what she'd been trained to do since childhood. Her struggles with memory and cognition in her later years took on a bitter irony. Here was a woman who'd spent decades being someone other than who she was born to be. And then the disease made her forget both identities. She couldn't remember being Rita Hayworth the star, but she also couldn't return to being Margarita Cancino, the dancer's daughter. Alzheimer's erased everything, leaving behind only the present moment. And even that became increasingly confusing as the disease progressed. And in her final years, through no choice of her own, but through Yasmin's advocacy, Rita's illness became a catalyst for change. The disease that destroyed her mind helped save others by bringing attention and funding to Alzheimer's research. The goddess who forgot became the symbol that helped the world remember. In 2022, Princess Yasmin Aga Khan was recognized by the French government with the Legion of Honor, France's highest civilian award, for her work raising Alzheimer's awareness around the globe. She accepted the honor in her mother's memory, another chapter in a story that began with a little girl named Margarita dancing in California border towns and ended with a worldwide movement to cure the disease that took her mother. The films remain. If you want to see Rita Hayworth, you can. Her films still exist, preserved and restored, available for new generations to discover. You can watch her dance with Fred Astaire in You'll Never Get Rich, see her dramatic range in Separate Tables, witness her at the absolute peak of her powers in Gilda. When you watch those films knowing what you now know about her life, they take on different dimensions. The glamorous woman on screen was also someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone who would eventually forget she'd ever been in these films at all. The smile that captivated millions masked insecurities that no amount of fame could resolve. The body that moved with such grace would eventually betray her, becoming a prison as her mind deteriorated. But the films also remind us why Rita Hayworth mattered. She wasn't just beautiful. Plenty of women in Hollywood were beautiful. She had something else, a quality that made her magnetic on camera. Whether it was the vulnerability Orson Welles identified, the technical skill Fred Astaire praised, or simply the way she inhabited her characters completely, Rita Hayworth gave performances that transcended their era and continue to resonate. The woman who was called the love goddess spent her life searching for love and never quite finding it. The star who was desired by millions felt unlovable in her private life. The performer who gave so much joy to audiences suffered profound unhappiness herself. These contradictions don't diminish Rita Hayworth's legacy. They're part of what makes her story compelling and tragic in equal measure. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There's a photograph from 1895 that tells you everything you need to know about what was about to happen. A young woman stands in a wedding dress that cost more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime, her face blank as porcelain. She's 18 years old. In a few hours, she'll marry a man she doesn't love in front of 2,000 guests, while the man she actually cares for sits somewhere across town, heartbroken. Her mother stands just outside the frame, making sure everything goes exactly according to plan. This is the wedding of Consuelo Vanderbilt, and it's the beginning of a story that would span 2 continents, 3 decades, and raise questions about the price women paid to maintain the fortunes of America's wealthiest families. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened to Consuelo, we need to go back to where it all started, in the glittering, ruthless world of Gilded Age New York, the Vanderbilt Empire and social ambition. The Vanderbilts weren't old money. They were new money, the newest money, really. And in the 1870s and 1880s, that distinction mattered more than almost anything else. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the family patriarch, had built an empire on railroads and shipping, accumulating a fortune that would be worth over $200 billion today. When he died in 1877, he left almost all of it to one son, William Henry, Consuelo's grandfather. William doubled the fortune in just 8 years. The Vanderbilts had money that made other wealthy families look poor, but they didn't have the one thing money couldn't quite buy: acceptance. New York society in the 1880s was controlled by women like Caroline Astor, whose family wealth stretched back generations. These women decided who was invited to the right parties, who could enter the right drawing rooms, who mattered. And the Vanderbilts, despite their massive wealth, were still considered a bit too close to their working-class roots, a bit too showy, a bit too desperate. Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo's mother, decided she was going to change that. She married William Kissam Vanderbilt, one of William Henry's sons, in 1875, and from that moment, she began plotting her assault on New York society. In 1883, she threw a costume ball at her new mansion on Fifth Avenue that cost approximately $3 million in today's money. 1,200 guests attended, all in elaborate historical costumes. The newspapers covered it for weeks. More importantly, Caroline Astor attended, essentially granting the Vanderbilts the social acceptance they craved. But Alva wasn't satisfied. She'd conquered New York. Now she wanted something bigger, something that would cement the Vanderbilt name in history forever. She wanted her daughter to marry European nobility, grooming an American princess. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2nd, 1877, at the very height of the Gilded Age excess. She grew up in a world of unimaginable luxury, summers at Marble House in Newport, winters in the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, servants everywhere, tutors and governesses managing every moment of her day. Her childhood residences were palaces in everything but name. Marble House alone, which Alva built as a summer cottage, cost $11 million and was modelled after the Petit Trianon at Versailles. But luxury and happiness, as it turned out, were very different things. From the time Consuelo was a small child, Alva had a plan for her. She wasn't raising a daughter. She was grooming a future duchess. Every aspect of Consuelo's upbringing was calculated, designed, controlled. She had no siblings her age to play with, only brothers who were either older or too young to be companions. Her world consisted of lessons, deportment training, and carefully supervised social interactions with children from similarly wealthy families. Consuelo's education was designed specifically to prepare her for European aristocracy. She was taught French until she spoke it perfectly, with the accent of the educated Parisian elite. She studied art, not just to appreciate it, but to discuss it knowledgeably with European aristocrats who valued cultural sophistication. She learned music, playing the piano with the skill expected of a lady of refinement. She studied literature, history, languages, all the accomplishments a proper European lady would need to navigate the intellectual salons of London and Paris. She learned to move gracefully, to speak correctly, to never show emotion when emotion wasn't called for. Alva even had Consuelo sleep with a steel rod strapped to her back to improve her posture. The result was a young woman of exceptional beauty and poise, with perfect carriage and an almost ethereal elegance. But beneath that polished exterior was a lonely child who'd never been allowed to simply be young. The physical discipline was nothing compared to the emotional control. Alva made it clear that Consuelo's purpose in life wasn't to be happy. It was to be useful to the family, to make an advantageous marriage, to bring honor to the Vanderbilt name. Affection was conditional, approval had to be earned, and the standards were impossibly high. Consuelo grew up believing that her worth lay entirely in her ability to fulfill her mother's ambitions. When Consuelo was about 7 years old, Alva took her to Europe for the first time, and young Consuelo watched her mother charm titled Europeans with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Alva collected introductions to aristocrats the way other people collected art. She studied the peerage books, memorized lineages, understood exactly who was who in the European social hierarchy. She understood, even then, what was being prepared for her. She was being shaped into the perfect offering to European nobility, a beautiful, cultured, immensely wealthy young woman who could restore a failing estate and bring fresh vitality to an old bloodline. By the time Consuelo was 16, she was exactly what Alva had created: beautiful, accomplished, perfectly mannered, and absolutely miserable. She was also, despite everything, developing her own ideas about what she wanted from life. And that's when she met Winthrop Rutherford. First, love and forbidden romance. Rutherford was everything a young woman of Consuelo's generation would find romantic. He was tall, handsome, athletic, charming, from an old and respected New York family. He was also kind to her, genuinely interested in what she thought and felt. For someone who'd spent her entire life being managed by her mother, this attention felt like freedom. They met at social events, carefully supervised, but they found ways to talk, to exchange letters, to develop real feelings for each other. Consuelo fell in love. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she felt like she had some control over her own future. Alva found out almost immediately. Nothing happened in Consuelo's life that Alva didn't know about. Her response was swift and absolute. Rutherford was forbidden from seeing Consuelo. His letters were intercepted and destroyed. When he tried to call at the house, he was turned away. Alva explained to Consuelo that Rutherford, while from a good family, wasn't good enough. He had no title, and more importantly, he wasn't wealthy enough to maintain Consuelo in the style she deserved. The Vanderbilts didn't need more American money. They needed European prestige. What happened next would shape the rest of Consuelo's life. Alva took her daughter to Europe for an extended tour, ostensibly for culture and education, but really to find a suitable aristocratic husband. They traveled through England and France, attending parties, meeting eligible titled men, all while Consuelo's heart remained with the young man back in New York. She was 17 years old, and her mother was shopping her to dukes and earls like she was a particularly valuable piece of merchandise. And that's when they met Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, and everything changed, but not in the way anyone expected. The Duke who needed money. The Duke of Marlborough was 23 years old when he first encountered Consuelo Vanderbilt in 1894. He was titled aristocratic, the custodian of Blenheim Palace, one of England's grandest homes, and absolutely broke. The British aristocracy was in crisis. The agricultural depression of the 1870s and 1880s had devastated the landed estates that formed the basis of their wealth. Death duties and taxes were rising. Maintaining vast ancestral homes required money that simply wasn't coming in anymore. For families like the Marlboroughs, there was really only one solution: marry American money. This practice had become so common by the 1890s that it had a name: the dollar princesses. Dozens of wealthy American women married into the British aristocracy during this period, trading their family fortunes for titles and social position. It was transactional, understood by everyone involved to be exactly what it was: a business arrangement. The Americans got prestige and status. The British got the money to maintain their estates and lifestyles. Charles Spencer Churchill needed approximately $2.5 million just to begin the repairs on Blenheim Palace. He needed a wealthy wife, and Consuelo Vanderbilt, with her massive dowry and impeccable grooming, was exactly what he was looking for. The fact that he found her beautiful was a bonus. The fact that she was in love with someone else was irrelevant. Alva saw immediately that this was the match she'd been preparing Consuelo for her entire life. A duke, Blenheim Palace, entry into the highest levels of British society. It was perfect. She began orchestrating the courtship with the same ruthless efficiency she'd applied to everything else in her life, breaking a young woman's will. But Consuelo resisted. She wrote letters to Rutherford, begging him to wait for her. She told her mother she didn't want to marry the Duke. She pleaded, argued, cried. Nothing worked. Alva had methods for dealing with resistance. She told Consuelo that if she refused to marry Marlborough, the shock and disappointment would kill her. Alva. She claimed her heart was weak, that the strain of Consuelo's disobedience would be too much. She wept. She raged. She isolated Consuelo from everyone except carefully selected servants who reported back to her. And then, in what would later be described in Consuelo's autobiography, Alva told her daughter that if she didn't agree to the marriage, she would make sure Rutherford faced serious consequences, that any future he might hope for would be destroyed. Whether this threat was real or not didn't matter. Consuelo believed it. She was 18 years old, isolated, exhausted from months of emotional manipulation, and she broke. She agreed to marry the Duke of Marlborough. The engagement was announced in September 1895. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church in New York City. 2,000 guests attended. The church was filled with orchids and lilies. Consuelo wore a dress of white satin embroidered with seed pearls with a 15-foot train. The newspapers described it as the wedding of the century, the perfect union of American wealth and British aristocracy. They didn't mention that the bride cried throughout the ceremony, or that she'd spent the days before the wedding in a state of such despair that she could barely function. Consuelo would later write that on the morning of her wedding, she woke hoping it was all a nightmare. When she realized it wasn't, she felt a sense of doom settle over her that wouldn't lift for years. She walked down the aisle toward a man she barely knew, giving up the person she loved, sacrificing herself for her mother's ambitions and her family's social position. The wedding cost approximately $300,000. The marriage settlement gave the Duke $2.5 million immediately, with another $100,000 a year for life. In exchange, Consuelo got a title and a prison she couldn't escape. But the story of what happened next, in the cold, ancient halls of Blenheim Palace, is where the real tragedy begins. A gilded prison. Blenheim Palace is magnificent. Built in the early 1700s as a gift from Queen Anne to John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, it's one of the largest houses in England, set in thousands of acres of grounds designed by Capability Brown. It's a monument to power, to history, to the glory of the British aristocracy. The Great Hall rises to heights that make you feel insignificant. The state rooms are filled with priceless art and furniture that had witnessed centuries of British history. The library contains thousands of rare books. It's the kind of place that tourists would later line up to tour, marveling at its grandeur. But it's also, as Consuelo quickly discovered, profoundly uncomfortable, almost impossible to heat properly, and filled with servants who viewed Americans with barely concealed contempt. The palace had been built for display, not for living. The corridors were drafty. The bedrooms were enormous and cold. In winter, frost would form on the inside of windows. The bathrooms were primitive by American standards. Consuelo, who'd grown up in houses with the latest modern conveniences, found herself in a medieval structure that valued history over comfort. She arrived as the new Duchess of Marlborough in late 1895, 18 years old, married to a man she didn't love, living in a foreign country, expected to take her place in a society that had very specific ideas about how an aristocratic wife should behave. The servants at Blenheim had their own hierarchy, their own traditions, their own ways of doing things that had been established long before she arrived. They viewed her American informality as ignorance, her attempts at friendliness as inappropriate familiarity. She was the mistress of the house in title, but in practice, she was an outsider trying to navigate a world that didn't want to accommodate her. And she was utterly alone. Her mother had returned to America. Her father, who might have been more sympathetic, was caught up in his own life and the scandal of Alva's divorce. She had no real friends in England, no one to confide in, no one who understood what she was experiencing. The other aristocratic women she met were polite but distant, curious about the American Duchess, but not particularly welcoming. Charles Spencer Churchill turned out to be cold, distant, and primarily interested in what her money could do for him. The romance that had been carefully cultivated during their brief courtship evaporated almost immediately after the wedding. On their honeymoon, he reportedly told Consuelo that he had married her only because he needed to save Blenheim. It was a devastating admission, stripping away any illusion that there might be affection or even respect in their relationship. He spent her dowry on the palace, on restoring the grounds, on bringing in craftsmen to repair centuries of neglect, on maintaining the lifestyle he believed was his birthright. Every dollar that flowed into Blenheim was a reminder that she had been purchased, that her value lay in her bank account rather than in herself. He expected her to produce heirs, to manage the household, to entertain appropriately, and to otherwise stay out of his way. When they had guests, she was expected to be the perfect hostess, charming, elegant, knowledgeable. When they were alone, he barely spoke to her. The emotional distance between them grew wider with each passing month. The English aristocracy operated by rules that were completely foreign to Consuelo. She'd been raised in American wealth, which was showy and excessive, but also relatively informal. English aristocratic life was rigid, hierarchical, obsessed with precedent and tradition. Every meal had specific rituals. Every social interaction followed prescribed forms. As the Duchess, she was expected to know all of this instinctively, and when she didn't, the mistakes were noted and remembered. Worse, she was expected to produce an heir. The entire point of marriages like hers was to continue the family line, to provide the next Duke of Marlborough. The pressure was immense and constant. When she became pregnant in 1896, there was relief all around, but it was short-lived. The birth was difficult. The baby, a son they named John, was healthy, but the experience left Consuelo shaken and unwell for months afterward. She became pregnant again soon after. Her second son, Ivor, was born in 1898. She'd done her duty. She'd provided an heir and a spare, a phrase she would later coin. But instead of bringing her and Charles closer together, the births seemed to create more distance. He had what he needed from her. The rest was irrelevant. The loneliness of those early years at Blenheim is hard to overstate. Consuelo's letters from this period, which she later drew on for her autobiography, describe days spent wandering the vast, empty rooms of the palace, trying to find purpose or meaning in her life. She had everything anyone could want: material wealth, a title, beautiful children, and she was desperately unhappy. She'd been sold into this life, and now she was trapped in it, finding meaning beyond the palace walls. But Consuelo wasn't the passive, obedient daughter her mother had tried to create. She began, slowly, to find ways to make her life bearable. She threw herself into charity work, something English aristocratic women were expected to do, but she did it with an intensity and genuine care that surprised people. She worked with the poor in the villages around Blenheim. She funded schools and medical clinics. She used her position and her money to actually help people. And for the first time since her marriage, she felt like she was doing something meaningful. She also began to develop friendships, real friendships, with other women in similar situations. Many of the American heiresses who'd married into the British aristocracy were discovering the same things Consuelo had: that the glamour covered profound unhappiness, that their husbands viewed them as income sources rather than partners, that they'd traded their freedom for a title that meant nothing without personal fulfillment. One person who became particularly important to her was Winston Churchill, the Duke's cousin. At the time, Winston was a young man making his way in politics, full of energy and ambition. He and Consuelo developed a deep friendship that would last for decades. She found in him the kind of intellectual companionship her husband could never provide. Winston, for his part, appreciated her intelligence and her genuine interest in the world beyond Blenheim's walls. And Consuelo needed that support, because her marriage was deteriorating rapidly. Charles was having affairs, not even particularly discreetly. He made it clear that he'd fulfilled his obligation by marrying her and producing heirs, and now he intended to live his life however he pleased. In aristocratic circles, this was considered normal, even expected. But Consuelo, raised in America despite all her European training, found it humiliating and painful, the return of lost love. By 1900, just 5 years into the marriage, Consuelo was at a breaking point. During a trip to Paris, she reconnected with Winthrop Rutherford, who had followed her to Europe. The feelings between them hadn't diminished. They spent 2 weeks together, and Consuelo realized that she still loved him, had never stopped loving him. When she returned to England, she told Charles the truth. She loved another man and wanted to leave. Charles's response was unexpected. He gave his permission for her to go. Perhaps he was relieved. Perhaps he'd already begun his own affair with Gladys Deacon, an American woman he would eventually marry. Either way, Consuelo travelled to London to meet with Rutherford, prepared to leave everything behind. But Rutherford refused her. Despite their love, despite the 2 weeks in Paris, he wouldn't take her away from her marriage. The reasons aren't entirely clear, whether it was concern for the scandal, worry about her children, or simply the complications of the situation. Rutherford told her to go back to her husband. Consuelo was devastated. She returned to Blenheim, but something fundamental had broken. She couldn't pretend anymore that the marriage was functional or that she could simply endure it for the sake of appearances. She and Charles began living increasingly separate lives, maintaining the public facade of a ducal couple while privately having almost nothing to do with each other. This arrangement continued for years. Consuelo threw herself into her charity work with even more intensity. During this period, she may have had an affair with the French artist Paul César Helot, who painted her several times. There were rumours about other relationships as well. Charles, meanwhile, pursued his relationship with Gladys Deacon openly, breaking free. By 1906, after 11 years of marriage, Consuelo and Charles officially separated. This was scandalous in itself. Separated aristocratic couples were expected to maintain appearances, to live together even if they despised each other. An actual physical separation was a public admission that the marriage had failed, and polite society didn't quite know what to do with it. Consuelo moved to London, taking a house called Sunderland House. For the first time since she was 18 years old, she was making decisions about her own life. She continued her charity work, threw herself into social reform movements, became friends with people who were working to change British society for the better. She was finally becoming the person she might have been if she'd been allowed to develop naturally. But she still wasn't free. She was separated, but not divorced. The Catholic Church, which Charles would later convert to, didn't recognize divorce. Getting an actual legal divorce seemed nearly impossible. She remained the Duchess of Marlborough, bound to a man she hadn't loved in years, unable to move forward with her life. That situation persisted through the 1910s. During World War I, Consuelo turned Sunderland House into a hospital for wounded soldiers. She worked tirelessly throughout the war, finding in the crisis a sense of purpose that had eluded her in peacetime. She organized relief efforts, raised funds, provided care for the injured. The war, terrible as it was, gave her something she'd been searching for, a way to make a real difference. After the war ended, the legal landscape around divorce began to change. New laws made it easier to obtain divorces, and both Consuelo and Charles wanted out of the marriage. Charles had been with Gladys Deacon for years and wanted to marry her. Consuelo wanted the freedom to build her own life. In 1921, they were finally granted a divorce, but that wasn't the end of it. To truly be free, Consuelo needed more than a legal divorce, and that's when she took the most dramatic step of her life. The truth comes out. In 1926, 5 years after the divorce, Consuelo petitioned the Catholic Church for an annulment. This was an extraordinary step, one that required her to testify publicly about the circumstances of her marriage. She had to prove that she had never freely consented to marry the Duke, that the entire marriage had been the result of coercion and force. The testimony was devastating and public. Consuelo described in detail how her mother had threatened her, manipulated her, worn down her resistance until she agreed to marry a man she didn't love. She talked about being locked in her room, about the threats against Rutherford, about Alva's claims that she would die if Consuelo didn't obey. It was a public repudiation of everything Alva had done, a declaration that the great triumph of Alva's social climbing had been built on cruelty and manipulation. What made the annulment possible was Alva's own testimony. In a stunning reversal, Alva supported her daughter's petition. She told the investigator plainly that she had forced Consuelo to marry the Duke, that she had always had absolute power over her daughter. Whether this was genuine remorse or simply pragmatism, since Alva herself had remarried and embraced new causes, including women's suffrage, is unclear. But her testimony was crucial. The Catholic Church granted the annulment in August 1926. In the eyes of the Church, Consuelo's marriage to Charles had never been valid because she hadn't entered into it freely. She was 49 years old. She'd spent 31 years of her life bound to a marriage she'd never wanted. Now, finally, she was free. A marriage of love, at last. But by this time, Winthrop Rutherford was long married to someone else. He had married Alice Morton in 1902, and after Alice's death in 1917, he had married Lucy Mercer in 1920. The love story that might have been was closed forever. Instead, Consuelo found happiness with someone else entirely. During her years in France and her social activities after the separation, she had met Jacques Bolsan, a French aviator and balloonist who had set numerous records in aviation. They had first encountered each other decades earlier when Consuelo was 17, at a ball in Paris. Balsan had fallen in love with her then, but she had been swept into marriage with the Duke before anything could develop. Now, finally, they had their chance. Consuelo and Jacques Balsan married on July 4th, 1921, shortly after her divorce from Charles was finalized. It was a quiet ceremony, nothing like the spectacle of her first wedding. Just two people who genuinely cared for each other, choosing to build a life together. The marriage to Balsan was, by all accounts, deeply happy. They settled in France, dividing their time between Paris and a chateau near Dreux. Consuelo finally had the partnership she'd always wanted, a relationship based on genuine affection, mutual respect, and shared interests. They entertained writers, artists, diplomats. Winston Churchill and his wife Clementine were frequent visitors. Consuelo continued her charitable work, now focusing particularly on children, building a sanitarium and running programs for local families. Interestingly, even Alva moved to a neighboring chateau to be near her daughter. The relationship between mother and daughter had healed somewhat after the annulment testimony, though it would never be uncomplicated. Alva died in 1933, having transformed herself from society matron to suffragette and social reformer. Jacques Balsan died in 1956, the same year Consuelo lost her younger son, Ivor. She had been married to Balsan for 35 years, far longer than her marriage to the Duke. Those decades were the happiest of her life, the years when she finally got to live according to her own choices rather than someone else's plans. The glitter and the gold. After Balsan's death, Consuelo lived another 8 years. She spent time in New York and Southampton, continuing her charitable work, maintaining her friendships, and reflecting on the extraordinary life she'd led. She had witnessed and lived through some of the most dramatic transformations in modern history. She'd seen the height of Gilded Age excess and its complete dissolution. She'd watched Europe tear itself apart in 2 world wars. She'd seen women go from being property to being citizens with full rights. She'd lived through the rise and fall of the aristocratic system that had imprisoned her. In 1953, she published her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, which told her story with remarkable honesty. The book wasn't bitter exactly, but it was unflinching. She didn't spare herself, acknowledging the affairs she'd had, the compromises she'd made. But she didn't spare her mother or Charles either. She wrote about Alva's manipulation with clarity and precision, describing exactly how a strong-willed mother could break down a young woman's resistance. She wrote about Charles's coldness, his indifference, his casual cruelty. It was a clear-eyed account of what it meant to be a woman in the Gilded Age, when daughters were assets to be deployed in the service of family ambition. The book was a sensation. People had always been fascinated by the dollar princesses, by the marriages that united American wealth and European titles, but most of the stories had been told from the outside, focusing on the glamour and the romance, the spectacular weddings and the grand houses. Consuelo's book showed what it was actually like from the inside: the loneliness, the coercion, the years of unhappiness hidden behind a beautiful facade. It gave voice to an experience that many women of her generation had shared, but few had been willing to discuss publicly. Readers were particularly struck by her description of her wedding day. The image of the 18-year-old bride crying as she walked down the aisle, going through the motions of a ceremony that felt like a funeral for her own hopes, resonated powerfully. It captured something essential about the Gilded Age: that all the wealth and grandeur in the world couldn't create happiness, that human needs for love and freedom and autonomy couldn't be bought off with mansions and titles. She lived long enough to see enormous changes in the world she'd been born into. The Gilded Age excesses that had shaped her childhood were long gone, swept away by income taxes, world wars, and changing social values. The British aristocracy she'd married into was a shadow of its former self, struggling to maintain estates and traditions in a world that had moved on. Many of the great houses had been sold, converted into schools or hotels, or simply demolished. Blenheim remained, but only because it had become a tourist attraction, open to the public who paid to walk through rooms where Consuelo had once lived in such isolation. Women had won the right to vote, to own property, to make their own decisions about marriage and family. The idea that a mother could force her daughter into marriage the way Alva had forced Consuelo seemed barbaric to a younger generation. The very concept of the dollar princess, of selling daughters to the highest bidder, was viewed as a relic of a more primitive time. Consuelo lived to see the world she'd been born into become history, something people studied rather than lived. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died on December 6, 1964, at Southampton, Long Island. She was 87 years old, having lived a full life by any measure. She was buried at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, Oxfordshire, near Blenheim Palace, alongside her younger son, Ivor. The choice of burial place was interesting. Not in America, where she was born, not in France, where she'd been happiest, but near the palace that had been her prison for so many years. Perhaps it was for Ivor, or perhaps it was a final acknowledgement of that part of her life, the years that had shaped everything that came after. She had outlived almost everyone from her Gilded Age youth. Alva was gone. Charles was gone. Rutherford had died in 1944. Most of the other dollar princesses had passed on. The world of her childhood, with its rigid social hierarchies and its obsession with titles and lineage, had vanished so completely that it seemed almost impossible to believe it had ever existed. She'd been born into one world and died in a completely different one, and her life spanned that transformation like a bridge between eras, a legacy beyond the dollar princesses. Looking back at Consuelo Vanderbilt's story, it's tempting to see it as unique, as the particular tragedy of one woman caught between powerful forces. But the truth is that her story was repeated, with variations, across the Gilded Age. Dozens of American heiresses married into European aristocracy, and many of them found themselves in situations similar to Consuelo's, trapped in loveless marriages, valued for their money rather than themselves, separated from everything familiar. Some of these women adapted. Some found happiness despite the circumstances. Some, like Consuelo, eventually escaped. And some never did, living out their entire lives in marriages that brought them nothing but misery. The dollar princess phenomenon ended, mostly, after World War I. The American fortunes that had seemed infinite in the 1890s were eroded by taxes and economic changes. The European aristocracy lost what remained of its power and prestige in the war and its aftermath. The social conditions that had made marriages like Consuelo's valuable to both sides simply disappeared. By the 1920s, wealthy Americans who wanted prestige found other ways to get it, and impoverished European aristocrats had to find other ways to maintain their estates. But Consuelo's story resonates beyond its historical moment because it's fundamentally a story about power. Who has it? Who doesn't? And what happens when the people without power try to claim some for themselves? Consuelo was born into enormous wealth and privilege, but she had no power over the most basic aspects of her own life. Her mother controlled her childhood, chose her husband, forced her into a marriage she didn't want. Her husband controlled her adult life, determining where she lived, how she spent her time, what was expected of her. It took her decades to claim any power for herself, and even then, it came at enormous cost. The annulment that freed her required her to testify publicly about her mother's cruelty. Her happiness with Bolsan came only after 30 years of an unhappy first marriage. The man she loved as a young woman married someone else and lived out his life without her. She got what she wanted in the end, but the price was almost everything she had to give, and yet she never stopped trying. That's perhaps the most remarkable thing about Consuelo Vanderbilt. She could have accepted her fate, lived out her life as the Duchess of Marlborough, found ways to be comfortable, if not happy. Many women in her position did exactly that, but Consuelo kept pushing, kept looking for ways to build a life that meant something to her, kept believing that she deserved more than what she'd been given. Her charitable work wasn't just a way to pass the time. It was a genuine attempt to use her privilege to help people who had less. Her friendships with reformers and intellectuals weren't just social connections. They were relationships that challenged her and helped her grow. Her decision to seek an annulment wasn't just about ending a bad marriage. It was about publicly declaring that what had been done to her was wrong. When she finally got the freedom she'd been fighting for, when she married Jacques Balsan and built a life based on love rather than obligation, she discovered what she'd probably known all along: that happiness was worth all the years of struggle, all the pain of fighting for it, all the cost of claiming it for herself. The Vanderbilt fortune is mostly gone now, dispersed through generations, eroded by taxes and time. Blenheim Palace still stands, a monument to an age that vanished a century ago. But Consuelo's story endures, a reminder of what was lost when women were treated as assets rather than people, and what was gained when one woman refused to accept that as her fate. Her life shows us that even in the most gilded of cages, even when every material comfort is provided, human dignity and freedom matter more than wealth or status ever could. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.